Thanks so much for joining us today. Good morning to all of you. My name is Tim Gore. I lead the Low Carbon and Circular Economy Programme at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. And this is our latest event in our Think 2030 series. Think 2030 is the name of a conference organised by IEEP together with our partners in the Think Sustainable Europe network of think tanks around the EU. And we are holding a series of events related to papers that we have produced together. So this is the latest regarding consumption. And we all know that increasing material use globally is a major driver both of biodiversity loss, of greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental pressures. And we also know that EU material consumption, although it's declined seemingly over the last 20 years, is still very high relative to other parts of the world and too high with respect to planetary boundaries. And we also know that cutting that EU material use can be a major contributor to achieving our climate targets, as well as the EU's wider environmental objectives. Now, currently the EU has various targets and indicators related to reducing waste and improving the material efficiency of the economy, but no targets currently to reduce in absolute terms the amount of materials consumed in Europe. But earlier this year, as I hope many of you joining this session will know, the European Parliament adopted a report on the new Circular Economy Action Plan, which called indeed both for an absolute decoupling of economic growth from material use in the European Union, but also called for a series of science-based, binding EU mid and long-term targets, including to reduce the use of primary raw materials, to reduce the environmental impacts associated with material use, and to significantly reduce the EU material and consumption footprints. So this event is designed to act as a bridge from that call from the European Parliament to see how we can move towards the establishment of such targets at the EU level. We've got an excellent range of speakers to help us to do just that today. So I'll just briefly introduce them while I run through the agenda for the next couple of hours. So first, we're going to have a keynote presentation from Dr. Jason Hickel, who is a visiting fellow at the LSE, senior lecturer at Goldsmiths at the University of London, and author of books including The Great Divide and most recently Less is More: How Degrowth Will Save the World. He's one of the world's leading proponents of degrowth, one of the key principles of which is to reduce the material throughput in the economy. So Jason's going to kick us off with a presentation. There'll be a little bit of time for a couple of questions from participants after that. And then we're going to move into the first panel. We have three of the MEPs who were critical in calling for the establishment of EU targets to reduce material footprint, consumption footprint. All three were shadow rapporteurs on the Parliament's report on the Circular Economy Action Plan. We have Sirpa Pietikäinen, who is a Finnish member of the EPP grouping in the Parliament. We have Mick Wallace, an Irish member of the Left grouping in the Parliament, and Margrethe Auken, a Danish member of the Green grouping in the Parliament. And then finally, we're going to have a second panel where we get some responses to those MEPs' demands for new targets. We're going to hear from Emmanuel Maire, who's head of unit in DG Environment in the European Commission. We're going to hear from Arturo de la Fuente, who's one of the leading experts on the measurement of these issues at Eurostat. And we're going to hear from Maeve Bolger, who is one of civil society's leading proponents and advocates for establishing such targets and action to reduce consumption in the EU. A couple of housekeeping rules. Please post any questions in the Q&A and we'll try and pick up on them. Usually it's not possible to get through all of the questions, but we'll do our best to pick out a few. You can also use the hashtag Think2030 to join the conversation on Twitter, and we'll do our best to respond to other questions and comments and reflections that are raised there or in the Q&A after the event as best we can. We're going to take the contributions from today and feed those into finalizing a paper on this topic, which we'll then be bringing out shortly after the event, and we'll look forward to sharing that with you all. So a final point to mention is that we are recording the session today, and we will try to make that available after the event as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jason Hickel, who's going to kick us off explaining just why it is so important that rich countries or regions like the EU reduce their material consumption. Over to you, Jason.
Great, thanks very much, Tim, for the kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with you all, despite it being rather early. So I'm looking forward to this. Let me just take a minute to share my screen, and we'll get going. Right. Okay, is that visible to you? There we go, great. So I want to begin just by emphasizing that the crisis that we face right now is not only about climate, although this is the one that of course captures our headlines and is one that we're primarily focused on. But it's actually a multi-dimensional ecological crisis that includes not only the climate crisis, but also deforestation, soil depletion, and mass rates of species extinction. And this is captured in the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which I'm sure that most of you are familiar with, I hope, one of the most important developments in ecological science over the past couple of decades. What this makes clear, and this is a range of different indicators, when they reach beyond this level here, then you're basically in a realm of breakdown and also uncertainty when you reach the red. That's true of climate change, but also of genetic diversity. So species extinction rates are very high right now. Land system change, mostly conversion to, this is deforestation and conversion to industrial agriculture, primarily beef, and biogeochemical flows from industrial agriculture that impact on soil depletion. Now, these other dimensions are driven primarily by excess resource use in the global economy, okay? When we think about excess resource use, we use the material footprint indicator, which is a robust proxy for environmental pressures, which I'll discuss shortly. And what we see when we do that is that resource use globally has been rising really dramatically over the past few decades, exceeding what industrial ecologists consider to be a safe maximum sustainable level, which is represented by this red line here at 50 billion tons per year, which we overshot in the late 1990s, and resource use has really accelerated quite dramatically since then. And the reason this is an important indicator is because we know from a variety of important studies that that resource use has very direct impacts on ecological sustainability. So resource use accounts for more than 90% of variation in environmental damage indicators. So it's a very robust proxy in that sense. The UN finds that it's responsible for 80% of global biodiversity loss. And a study from 2004 shows that there's a very tight coupling between aggregate mass flows, which are represented here, and ecological impacts, right? So even while the impact of various kinds of extraction depends on the context, depends on the material, and depends on the technology used, at an aggregate level, there's a very tight coupling between mass flows and impacts, okay? So we call this the Anthropocene, but this actually is a misnomer. Of course, it's a useful term in the sense that it points to the fact that these are human-generated problems, but the terminology is incorrect in as much as it suggests that humans in general, a kind of generic humanity, is responsible for this crisis, when in fact, that's not accurate. It's primarily being driven by a small handful of rich nations. And this is what happens when we look at material footprint in per capita terms divided by country income group over time, right? So here we have low-income countries which consume in the region of 2 to 3 tons of materials per person per year, whereas high-income nations consume in the region of 28 material tons per person per year right now, which is significantly over the sustainable per capita boundary. In fact, about 4 times over, right? So this is striking because what it means is that not only are high-income nations the major drivers of global ecological breakdown, if we were to all consume like the average person in the rest of the world, we would not be in a condition of resource overshoot at all, which is quite striking. Furthermore, what's represented in this graph is the fact that this overshoot by rich nations effectively precludes poorer nations from increasing their resource use to meet human needs, right? So, we know that development does entail infrastructure build out and material throughput, and it's necessary that increases in poorer nations. But that's not possible to do in an ecologically safe way without causing further ecological breakdown, unless rich nations actively scale down their resource use. Okay, so there's a really important global justice dimension here, which we have to take account of. And we need to call for convergence in the global economy so that resources can be mobilized around meeting human needs universally while also remaining within planetary boundaries. Okay. Crucially also, the high levels of resource use that are characteristic of high-income nations exert damage not in high-income nations primarily, but primarily in the global south, okay? So the impacts of excess consumption in rich nations are offshored to the south. And we know that's true because of research that demonstrates that high-income nations rely on a large net appropriation of resources from the rest of the world. Okay, so there's a net flow of resources from the global south to the global north every year, which sustains consumption in rich nations. And we can see that in the empirical record very clearly. 10.1 billion tons of raw material equivalents flow from south to north net each year. 800 million hectares of embodied lands. So that's twice the size of India. That means that land twice the size of India is appropriated entirely for products designed for consumption in the global north, right? That's extraordinary amounts of land. 3.7 billion barrels of oil equivalent are appropriated from the south, and 379 consumes. Again, this is a net appropriation. So that's equivalent to 200 million people working full-time to service excess consumption in the global north without any compensation effectively in terms of labor flows. So what this means is that southern resources and labor are effectively roped into servicing northern consumption rather than meeting southern needs. And this is one of the reasons why, despite high levels of global resource use, most of which again comes from the global south, we still have mass poverty across the global south, right? Because the economy is organized around excess consumption in rich nations rather than meeting human needs in poorer nations. There's also a crucial climate dimension to resource use, which Tim gestured towards in his opening remarks. And that is that production and consumption in the material economy is the major driver of energy use, right? So the more production and consumption that we do, the more energy is required for that, and the more difficult it is, therefore, to decarbonize the energy system, okay? So there's a climate dimension to this. So just to illustrate this, in 2018, when the IPCC published their special report on 1.5 degrees, they were very clear on what needs to happen to stay beneath this threshold. Here's historical emissions rising, and this is the decline that's necessary by the middle of the century. We know this now, it's a stylized fact, 0 by 2050. Of course, for high-income nations, given their disproportionate responsibility for causing the problem with their historical emissions, under the Paris Agreement, they have a responsibility to reduce emissions much more quickly than the global average, okay? So we talk about 2050, that's a global average target. High-income nations have a responsibility to move much more quickly than that. So the EU's target for 0 by 2050, it flies in the face of core climate justice principles. We need to be aiming for something like 2030. The question becomes, is such rapid decarbonization possible, 2030 or even 2050? The answer is yes, but only if high-income nations scale down energy use, okay? And the best way to scale down energy use is by reducing excess material throughput. And this is represented in one of the core scenarios in the IPCC's 2018 report. The underlying study is by Grubler et al. And what they demonstrate is that a significant reduction of material throughput in rich nations is necessary to reduce energy use sufficiently to achieve rapid decarbonization without having to rely on speculative net negative emissions technologies, which are highly risky and dubious, okay? So this is actually core to any possibility of accomplishing our climate goals. In sum, resource use is reducing resource use is an ecological imperative in terms of reversing biodiversity loss, reversing ecological degradation, restoring soils, et cetera, et cetera. It's a global justice imperative in terms of removing the pressure for extractivism from the global south, effectively liberating poorer countries to be able to mobilize their resources and labor around meeting human needs rather than around servicing excess consumption in the north, okay? And finally, it's a climate imperative for the reasons I've just outlined. So the good news is as follows. We know that we can deliver high levels of human development for all, with significantly less resource and energy than we presently use. And we have bottom-up modeled studies demonstrating this, that high-income nations could reduce their material consumption by 75%, getting back to around 8 tons per person per year, and still deliver universal healthcare, education, housing, electricity, power, public transportation, et cetera, all the things that are necessary for a flourishing society, okay, with significantly less materials and energy. The way you do that is by organizing the economy around meeting human needs rather than around capital accumulation, which is the opposite of how our economy is presently designed. We presently mobilize resources and labor around capital accumulation, primarily to the benefit of elites, and many human needs are left unmet. So we have to reverse that, okay? How do we get there? I'm just going to, this is what today's discussions are about. I'm just going to lay out a few core ideas that emerge from the literature in ecological economics. The first and most important thing is the topic of today's discussion, which is the imperative of introducing binding targets for material footprint reduction. And here I mean specifically material footprints, not other indicators like domestic material consumption. We have to be able to account for the impacts embodied in trade, okay? This should also include scaling down specific problem industries. So instead of assuming that all industries should grow perpetually all the time, regardless of whether or not we need them, we should have a conversation about what industries we actually want to grow, things like public transportation and renewable energy, and what industries are too big and could actively be scaled down without harming human well-being, right? Things like SUVs, arms, fast fashion, the beef industry, et cetera. Shifting from private cars to public transportation becomes really essential here. The infrastructure required for private cars is extremely materially and energy intensive. This is a stylized fact now as well. Public transportation is much more efficient and also meets human needs. Limitations to advertising. This has been robustly studied now. We know that reductions in advertising spending and advertising exposure simultaneously reduce material throughput as well as improving human well-being, right? People report higher levels of happiness when they're exposed to less advertising, right? So this is a powerful intervention that we could consider, and there's already ideas towards what that would look like. Banning the practice of planned obsolescence. This, of course, is core to our discussions around this. So many of our products are effectively designed to break down in order to increase corporate turnover. So we can battle that by legislating extended product warranties, guaranteeing that products last 2, 3, 4 times longer than they presently do. And that's a very powerful gain, because if our products last, say, 3 times longer than they presently do, that means we consume 66% less of them without any loss to our access to the resources that we need, okay, for daily life. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge one crucial political sticking point here, which is that as we scale down unnecessary parts of the economy and reduce resource use, this also at the same time reduces the amount of labor that's necessary in the economy, right? And one of the reasons we can't have this conversation is because of the question of jobs. Anything that might reduce employments becomes problematic politically. And so it's essential that we address that concern up front. And I think that's probably the most powerful intervention would be to shorten the working week to maintain full employment as this happens. Or alternatively, introduce a public job guarantee to mobilize labor with a living wage and skilling around ecological regeneration and the renewable energy transition, which does require quite a lot of labor. So by doing this, you effectively maintain full employment, and you take the question of jobs entirely off the table. And once that happens, then the logjam is effectively broken, and you can have a conversation about how to reorganize the economy in order to reduce ecological impacts and meet human needs. I think this is actually a really important piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, the one that we're all familiar with is the importance of replacing GDP with more holistic measures of progress. We know that GDP growth is very tightly coupled to material footprint indicators. And even with high levels of efficiency improvements, that coupling is difficult to break, if not impossible. Absolute decoupling is very difficult to achieve in a growth-oriented economy. And so it's crucial, I think, that we aim for more holistic indicators. Instead of growing the GDP and hoping that it will somehow magically solve the social problems and ecological problems that we have, let's think more strategically about what we actually want to achieve, reductions in ecological impact and also improvements in human well-being. better education, better housing, better healthcare, and target those directly rather than through this very problematic, widely understood to be problematic proxy. So that's where I want to leave it, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks so much, Jason, for kicking us off, giving us that overview of the challenge. Let me just follow up with one question for you before we move to the first panel, which is just about the politics of this. And so I think you've touched there on a number of the policies that can help us to achieve reduction in material use in the economy. And you've given a sense of some of the co-benefits of that, improved happiness and perhaps job guarantees and so on. But can you just give us a sense of, how popular do you think these measures are? Do we have any evidence to suggest that politicians could even get elected with a policy agenda like this? How can we go from the scientific evidence of what's needed to actually making this a political agenda that can win widespread support? What evidence is there of that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's something curious about the post-growth, ecological economics literatures. We focused so much on demonstrating empirically that we can deliver good lives for all with significantly less resource and energy use, and that's a very well-established fact now. What has been researched less is the political strategy for getting there. So I can give you a few ideas. We know from public opinion surveys that there's actually remarkable evidence on the fact that people assent and actively support post-growth, key post-growth principles. Things like a public job guarantee poll in the region of 70 to 80% in the US and UK, for example. I mean, that's very powerful. We know that around 70 to 80% of people polled around Europe and the USA believe that ecological stability is more important than growth. We know that similar proportions also believe that excess consumption is a problem, not making us happier, and we can reduce it while at the same time improving people's lives. A similar proportion polled in the UK believe that the government's objective should be not to increase GDP growth, but rather to focus on human well-being. So from opinion poll after opinion poll, we know that there's a strong popular political consensus around this. It doesn't get represented in our politics, however. And I guess there's different reasons we could think about that. Why do politicians not take this idea up? Although we see that when it does happen, it's extraordinarily popular. For example, when New Zealand's broke away from GDP growth as a core government objective, I mean, this idea went viral in social media and inspired an incredible amount of excitement. Was followed then shortly thereafter by Scotland and Iceland making similar statements. The president of Ireland recently delivered an extraordinary speech about the imperative for a post-growth economy. So the idea is catching on, is very popular among the sort of grassroots, if you will. So it does become a question of political strategy. I think that the key thing here is alliances between environmental movements and working class movements, right? Because too often this is framed as an antagonism, precisely because of the question of jobs. And so we have to front load our conversation by addressing that question directly, putting forward a positive vision for flourishing lives for all first, so that we can scale down ecological impacts.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Yeah, well, that's a great segue, of course, into our first panel, talking to some of the members of the European Parliament that really are at the forefront of thinking through how indeed we do translate this scientific evidence for the need to reduce material throughput into a political agenda. So really happy to welcome again Sirpa Pitkäinen, Margaret Elkin and Mick Wallace, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, were instrumental in securing the Parliament's support for calling for these reduction targets. So I'm going to start by asking each of you to give your reflections really on why you think the Parliament has called for this. What were the key arguments in your view that persuaded your colleagues to adopt this call? What were the most convincing arguments that helped to secure those support both within your own political groups and across party lines? And perhaps we'll start with you, Sirpa. What did you find were the key convincing arguments?
Well, first of all, what I'm trying to do, especially among my own colleagues in EPP, and others where to is to sort of concentrate on the factual side. Firstly, if we do not know the scale of the challenge, and if you do not have the adequate basic information, and this is the metering, you can't get the right actions on place. And then sort of going in there, we all know that we would need, the science-based targets, but those targets should include the past backcasting approach. So to look upfront, what is the exponential increase on the consumption of that material that is sort of envisaged. And then actually you shouldn't, so for example, in plastics reduced with 20%, you should actually effectivize and reduce by 80%. And then the second point is that if you do not have the measuring, or it is like in economics, if you do not have the budget, then how do you know whether you are actually achieving your budget? And if you don't have the budget, you don't know what to achieve. And then, like we are talking about the climate budget, we should have a resource budget within the 30 years and start backcasting from there, where to use it. And actually, this is a lot of the discussion, what we heard with the previous speaker, and what to do. And then to know what is the scale. And by the scale, I mean, we are not talking about 5% or 10% efficacy in resource efficiency. And not only the absolute decoupling, we are talking about 10-fold resource efficiency, as we know, and this factor 10 has been circulating around for a couple of tens of years already, but we have seen very little action there. So just to sort of say, look, let's not make it a political debate. I like wood, or I like cement, or this is better, or that is better, or the agriculture in Netherlands are sustainable, or cars in Germany. Let's put the facts on table. Let's put the budget, and then you just sort of follow with the common harmonized indicators in this monitoring platform, how effective actually you are. And then my last sort of a point, what I've been trying to use, sometimes more, sometimes less effective, is that it is all very, very destructive for the economy and industries to go every 5 years and tighten up the targets and change the targets. It would be much better if you would know already now up to 2050 that, let's say, this 10-fold is the target you need to achieve, and this is the metering that is going to be used, instead of a sort of this time having 10% energy efficiency, and after 5 years it is 15 or 20, depending on political haggling, and you can't have a very safe and long-term investment environment for that. And if you want to succeed with that kind of a blooming economies or service economy, or on these new technologies, you need this long-term perspective and certainty where to invest. And this is what we are lacking in politics. And as said, it was 2015 already when Parliament said on its own initiative report that we would need to have an absolute decoupling, and that we would need to have, beside that, the binding resource efficiency targets. And what is the figure of that? Then it is the political debate. We never sort of made it in the Parliament, nor in 2015, nor this time to settle the 10-fold efficiency or 80% reduction target that we actually tried to sort of negotiate to have it as 2050 target there. A lot of other elements, but this doesn't sound so interesting or sexy to talk about indicators and accounting and backcasting and targeting and budgeting. But I think that if we do not get this right, you can't get the policy only by talking about generalities right either. And so I hope that this would be the first priority by the Commission and the science community to just put that element on place, either within the legal framework, and if we do not succeed it, then it should be outside the legal framework, but as an information and putting the facts on the table. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sirpa. So a really clear call there to establish the budgets and the long-term objectives, and then to backcast and to make sure that that gives that long-term certainty for investors for the economic shifts that are needed. Thanks so much. Should we turn to you next, Mick, and tell us, I mean, why did you support, you know, the strong language in the Parliament's position on this, and what did you find are the most convincing arguments here?
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. I should say first that I am a big fan of Jason, and I appreciate very much the clarity that he has brought to the subject. And I've read both his books twice. In fact, I read Less is More for the second time over the weekend, and I was trying to sum up today's topic in his book, but he actually done a much better job on it than I was trying to do. But anyway, look at okay, why do we support it? Well, I suppose first of all, the question is a little bit odd. Absolute decoupling of resource use from economic growth is pretty much impossible. Obviously, that's why degrowth is so important. I mean, your discussion is looking at the material footprint reduction targets, and I think that a material footprint reduction target and absolute decoupling don't necessarily sit well together, but it's still useful to address the question. Firstly, in paragraph 6 in the report, references absolute decoupling of resources used from economic growth, and the call for mid and long-term targets for resource reduction in paragraph 6 is in this context. But, and this is the important point, this call for absolute decoupling of resource use from economic growth is kind of a flaw at the heart of the report. This sounds like a very good thing, but there is a growing body of thought on the subject that shows there is no empirical evidence that absolute long-lasting global decoupling is happening, or is at all likely to happen, or is even possible. The European Environment Agency's briefing called Growth Without Economic Growth summarizes this literature well, and it does make several references to Jason's work. Decoupling and green growth are kind of distracting fantasies. They are suggested as solutions only because they're compatible with the prevailing political and economic logic of neoliberalism, unfortunately. So I don't specifically support or agree with that line in paragraph 6 in relation to decoupling, but I did support the report as a whole. I believe there are a lot of positives in the Commission. Solidarity are also very clear. Even if absolute decoupling of growth from resource consumption is theoretically possible, its success must be measured in terms of climate targets and whether or not it can happen sufficiently fast enough to limit global warming to 1.5. On that basis, there's simply no scientific basis for not questioning the growth imperative. We do need to pursue a radical degrowth strategy instead, one that pursues a goal of sufficiency as well as efficiency. And that might include, for example, as Jason mentioned, a planned move to a 4-day week or even less, and a ban on advertisement in public spaces, among other measures. In terms of why we supported the call for science-based targets and specifically material footprint reduction targets, I mean, these are the targets that we call for in our amendments, and of course, the targets should be science-based, and it's crucial that the targets should be binding so that they can be enforced. Our amendment proposed binding minimum 50% material footprint and consumption footprint targets for EU by 2030, but it was rejected. But in paragraph 7, we still managed to agree that the centerpiece targets of the report would be material and consumption footprint targets, that the targets would be binding and science-based. We couldn't agree a specific percentage target. it was either too high for some or too low for others. So instead, in paragraph 7, we call on the Commission to come up with these targets based on science specifically. The report states to bring the EU back within planetary boundaries by 2050. 2050 is late, but for this, still, it's a bit of a win. The draft report here only asks for a resource efficiency target. And resource efficiency is, of course, positive, but it's far, far more important to aim for an absolute reduction in resource use. I also believe that the environmental footprint and the idea of planetary boundaries used by the Global Footprint Network are reasonable proxies to help establish material footprint and consumption targets. And if the EU is already consuming over 2.5 planets, then we roughly need to consume half and less than half than what we do today. I think the real clear message from Jason's book, Less is More, is that GDP growthism is no longer sustainable. We're not going to actually seriously deal with the challenges that we're talking about here until we go to that space. Capitalism, as we know it, is not going to allow us to get to where we want to get to. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Mick. So this is an even more challenging vision of the deeper changes needed in the economy, and move away from the concept, of growth or the dependency on growth in the EU. But I think really interesting what you say, that at the Parliament it was possible to agree the principle of calling for these targets, and that they should be science-based, that they should be binding, that they should be with respect to bringing the EU's consumption back within planetary boundaries. But the number, it wasn't possible to agree on the number at the moment, and so the call is there to the Commission to do that, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we move towards establishing a number and winning political support for it throughout the rest of this meeting. Let's turn now to Margrethe Auken, MEP from Denmark, from the Green grouping. From the Green side, why were you supporting the call for these targets, and what do you think are the most convincing arguments that persuaded others to get behind it?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And while I was listening to Jason Hegel, I was thinking, I picked among my books this one here, that is Schumacher. It came in 1973. Small is Beautiful. And I used it strongly in the mid-70s to convince, my party, my political surroundings, my society, that now we have to turn into this strategy. And well, this whole point on you cannot have unlimited growth in a limited planet was very convincing, presented by this high-ranking economist in UK in 73. And the real depressing thing is that we have known this here all these many years. And it has been, of course, you have had some wonderful ideas of this decoupling, and we can just have growth, and we find all the technical solutions and smart solutions, and then we will find a way. Although we have seen, every time we have seen into what has de facto happened, we can see that this has never happened. And that was also the conclusion, as was mentioned just by Mick, from the Environmental Agency this in January. It came that green growth, sustainable growth, or whatever you call it, it's growth. And it cannot be catch in this growth vision. And I could add that if it was only people like us here and CEAP, yes, we had to convince it. I wouldn't say it would be a piece of cake, but then I could see how it would be possible. But what we de facto has to call for is that, very many privileged people have to turn their way of life into something quite different, which for many people will be seen as a limitation of their possibilities. It's much easier to get accustomed to have a higher standard of living than to have a lower. And even if I ask people, didn't you have a nice life 20 years ago? And they say, yes, but the screaming which will arise when you start to come on these things. I love one of the good conditions on transport, it's clear that public transport, I would also add, link it to the bicycles, because then you have your link bicycles and public transport, you will solve a lot of problems. But now we just have in Green Denmark a new plan with new motorways, bridges, and so on and so forth. And although we probably the country in the world with with less land accessible for nature, it's still, like this year. And all the knowledge we have that every time you enlarge a motorway, we get more cars. It's seen all over the world through decades. We know it, and still we're just continuing like that. It's very depressing what I'm saying here, but I feel that however good goals we put, if we don't link them very, very close to the campaigns, the convincing arguments, telling people how we can keep up that part of the good life where you still can have your online infrastructure, you can still have a kind of moving around, we can still find out keeping up a production capacity where we still can get good products. I think it's so important what we have done in the report, putting conditions on products, on Jason Hickel mentioned these conditions, and they should be put as soon as possible on all products. But how do we then make sure that we are not creating unemployment, that we are not seeing that we are going down, and we even have a recession? And that has to be, I think we need a more progressive economists to figure out how this can be done, so we not only have the nice goals and see how wonderful the life can be if it's just enjoying nature, arts, and this here, but really how do we avoid that the society will turn into a slum society? And these injustices, very well described in the presentation just before, global injustices also will occur much stronger in our own societies. And not to say any single word against what has been said just before, up to now, but I think it's one of our main tasks to have this coupling of campaign and very, very concrete examples of how this can be done in a way where we still keep up, jobs. And it sounds easy. We make a job guarantee. It's not that easy. It sounds easy that we just go down in work time. I can tell you, the more work-saving machinery you get, the more you have to work. We've seen it all our life. If I'm looking at people sitting here, all of us, we are saving working time the whole time. When we're going on holiday, when we're in the trains, when we're in our summer house, we're sitting there saving work time, and you will see how much we are working. And so I won't prolong it this year too much, because I think it was so well said, and I think that our report, which got the great support, and I thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to see this, very passive commission. Sorry, yes, but it's a fact that it's probably the most passive commission I've seen, and I've been in European Parliament since 2005, in politics since 79, coming forward with proposals where we can go in and see here we have the absolutely needed step forwards, and that they are not there to safeguard business as usual, but really turning this here. And I will, at the other hand, and say that I think that we can get people behind us if they can see that what we present is realistic, is feasible, and that we will, if we stick together, we'll be able to manage this here. And I also think that even if we will have a lot of screaming from the riches, as you in a way say, that will be extreme. How we will hear, I know coming from a country where we are still willing to pay taxes. If we see how much the riches try to do to avoid paying taxes, it's incredible. And but I will put it like this here and say that we should stick to clear targets, measurable targets, binding targets, and then also make it clear that this decoupling we are talking about is not a decoupling from growth, but it's a decoupling from the threat of recession, injustice, all this here. So we can do this here in a way where we are having also the rest of our own societies and the rest of the world with us in it. And I haven't seen it yet, I must admit, although I've been screaming for this since, yes, as you can hear, since the I'm very old, since the mid-70s. The only thing I can say, I'm not giving up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret. Yes, and I think, as you say, it's sort of a common theme emerging here that we need to make sure that we're linking this call for consumption reductions to a vision of the good life, as you put it, to the co-benefits, the things that the positive vision of what this will mean for the way that we live our lives, and indeed for the economy as a whole. Let me come back to you now, Sirpa, if I may, and just push you a bit more on what should happen next. I mean, as you said yourself, it's not the first time that the Parliament has called for this stuff. Made the call already in 2015. The Commission didn't pick up on it with the new Circular Economy Action Plan, didn't propose those binding targets when it had the opportunity to last year. So what can we do to make sure that this time it's different? Of course, we have a speaker from the Commission, and we're going to get an update also from Eurostat after this about the developments on the data gathering side, which are obviously important. But from your side, what are the most important things that need to happen now? How can the Parliament keep the pressure up? What more can you do as a Parliament? And what more do you want to see from other stakeholders to make sure that this isn't just a report and another call from the Parliament that goes nowhere, but that we actually this time make the progress that we need?
Well, I think that this is the crucial question. And in the aftermath of 2015, I guess what we can learn as a lesson from that time is that we should have been pressurizing the Commission harder to come up with the targets. And the pressurization means that we as MEPs that are interested about this topic would put that as a proposal, as an amendment to all reports that are even remotely linked to that target, so that it comes as a steady message quite a number of times every year, constantly from the Parliament. We should be posing questions to Commission once in a while, where you are, what are your plans with the monitoring platform and these targets Parliament asked you to come. The Environment Committee should ask the Commission to come up front asking that. And hopefully we could have that kind of sort of a pressure. What then should have happened, and this is something, because I know the Commission and the Environment section, they are not against. It is just a question how to prioritize it and get the whole college report on it. And the point is that I think it would be very important to have it as a technical issue, because it is in vast detail technical, together with Eurostat, together with European Environmental Agency, together what we are preparing for NFRD, the reporting, and we all heard about the failures and problems with taxonomy when it ends up with this kind of a political haggling instead of a sound sort of indicator system. So I think that the Commission would have the leverage, they would have the powers internally without any specific legislation. I might be wrong on this, but I think to put on preparation that kind of a resources for the Eurostat and Environment Agency, that these should sort of a technical, together with EFRAG and others, start preparing that knowledge and platform. And we know that in environment DG, there's already this natural capital accounting methodologies, and we have them globally and so on. So all this, and then if there's the necessary changes, for example, in the mandate and statutes of Eurostat, that should be technically be brought as soon as possible to Parliament to deal in the Econ Committee. where that then stands. And I hopefully I hope that we could find a handful of member states that would be donating their statistical units and sort of giving the support for this. And last but not least, and I know that the Think 2030 has been working on this, I don't know how far we could sort of voluntarily create that kind of a science platform and the existing indicators and just start publicizing them and just sort of start benchmarking Commission's proposals, our budgets, national budgets, EU budgets, and other actions. So where we are heading to, just to show that, okay, the direction is wrong. And actually, we do not have very much time. I'm really, really concerned. We heard Margaret and others about the concept. We discussed this already in 60s and early 70s after the first report of the Club of the Rome. So this is not actually breaking news. And it is astonishing that the whole generation we've been oh and who's and whether or not this is a urgent pressing issue and whether to do something about it or not. And actually it is a very high political pressure from certain industries, as we can see from the taxonomy debate. And we should not underestimate that. And this needs to be public. It needs to have a strong vocal civil society support, a bit like, you know, Greta Thunberg's and climate. And what I would hope this time is that, this is not to blame Greta Thunberg, but if you always say it in general level, please do something. It's so easy for politicians to come, you know, and take a photo, selfie with Greta. Yes, I'm for the environment, because you do not commit anything technical or binding. But if we could have a broader civil society saying, besides this broader message, you need to have a binding regulation to cut to 1/10 the use of resources by 2050. You have to ban the obsolescence. You have to, what have you done? Then it would be much harder to sort of a photo pose in general level if you really are not backing the ideas, and that might increase, of course, the political support for the issues too when they are increased. And then, of course, some sort of whatever learning that would be teachings for media, responsible media, because, of course, we always see the news about the glaciers melting and climate change progressing, and that we have more cows than human beings, not to talk about other wild animal species that is less than 6%. But we do not have that often that kind of a media coverage that sort of states that these are the 5 things we should be doing, and asking the politicians, are you doing it or are you not doing it? And somehow we would need to wake the interest for that kind of a debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Sirpa. Obviously, we're going to hear later from one of the colleagues in civil society that's, I guess, trying to build exactly that kind of platform that you talked about. Let me just, one follow-up question, if I may, about the role of industry here or the private sector. And you spoke in your opening remarks about the importance of giving long-term certainty for investors about the direction of travel. And you've also spoken about, you know, the way that certain industries are a major barrier to making progress in this area, as we've seen in other areas like on the taxonomy. What's your sense about where the private sector is at on this question of reducing material use? Are there allies? Are there stakeholders in the private sector that are on board that can be mobilized to support political action on these targets? Are we doing enough to engage those actors? Because surely that's one of the things that may have changed compared to 2015 hopefully there are more actors in the private sector that are prepared to make these demands now. But what's your experience of that?
Well, first, and I hope that all the politicians would pick up this point, there isn't such a thing as an industry opinion. The industries and people in industries are as diverse as we politicians. Le Pen, Mike Wallis, and myself, we think a bit differently how to solve the problem. And that matter, Mike and I share the fact with Margaret that the problem exists. Le Pen probably doesn't. And the business is a bit alike. And I would say that the most advanced and radical businesses, and they are quite often very successful ones, not always, but successful ones, because they can sort of see for the future. They are at least as radical than I am. And some of them are far more radical than Mike Wallis, creating the meaning and asking what is the justification of doing a business and all the ESG and trying to have the calculation of the footprints. But that sort of advanced part is, I don't know, it's hard to tell the figures. It's 10, 15, 20%. But there's a very big commitment globally. And I hope we could align with those ones who have committed to be future-proof and have a transition plan to be climate neutral by 2030. And there's quite a bunch of businesses already doing that. And if we could raise the voice, they are more vocal what they used to be 5 years, not about 10 years ago. But still, and I guess my colleagues could agree with me, if I compare the lobbying to the parliament, the sort of forward-looking businesses that are much more forward-looking than any of the EPP colleagues or ECR and more than half of the Renew. For the others, I do not know so much if there's the shared ground and how much, but at least there, they are not vocal. They are not coming to the parliament, to the conservatives in Renew and EPP and ECR. What the heck are you doing? You are drowning the whole world and destroying my business. Why are you saying that sort of having the old pipe infrastructure and coal and a single-use textile is the future? Because it's not. Why do you say it's not doable? I'm doing it already. So that's a part of the story, that this lobbying is next to non-existent compared to that lobbying that is, for example, to me, and I guess quite a number of people do know what I think by definition. They are lobbying don't do and can't do, and Finnish forest industry, Polish economy, Polish coal, German cars, Netherlands and agriculture, and you could call it indefinitely. Basically telling that anything too radical, and then the last in Europe would shut down the lights. And then if you are not the politician who really sort of concentrates, reads and thinks and understands business and economics, there's always the risk that not only those ones that are retarded in environmental thinking, but those in betweens, they believe the message. They believe we do already enough. They believe we are sustainable. They believe our economy is destroyed if we increase the ambition level. And so we would need to sort of compensate that huge, and actually it is increasing lobbying sort of volume, what comes from that sort of old-fashioned backbenchers in industries. And it's a bit like, I guess, lately I've been thinking, it is less than a third of the societies that are nationalistic, populistic, hatred, whatever, type of the guys. But sometimes when you look at social media and media, and you hear the opinions, you would think at least half of the Europeans have gone crazy, and Americans as well. They're very active, they're very vocal, they're very aggressive, and they seem to be the voice of the people. And somehow we would need to correct that, okay, this is not the voice of the industry, this is not the voice of the economy, that matter, this is not the voice of the people, and sort of heighten up, use the megaphone on the good voices and good stories. And very good example there, I don't know how we could intensify the cooperation, is that not always with a so great reputation, but these McKinsey's, PwC's, and others, the big consultancies and auditing companies, they are way ahead and very analytical, and World Economic Forums. They might not be quite like Mike Wallis, but they are quite radical if you look sort of the mediocre business or political thinking on this environmental and resource efficiency. How could we use this voice, saying that, look, these guys are coming from business, they are educated on business, they are doing and consulting and teaching business. And if they say, Houston, we have a problem and we need to fix it, you better listen that. And that certainly is not against business. It is a pro-business, and it is a business-based idea. And I'm not so sort of obsessed with the businesses and economy as I might sound. But the reason for that is that I think that if we can't activate this side more to be vocal, it's very hard to change the conservative voices in politics and get the support. Sorry about my voice.
We'll let your voice recover a bit, Sitpa, but thanks so much for that. Exactly. So some clarity there on needing to get the scientific community and the technical issues established, support from civil society being key, but also mobilizing that more progressive private sector voice, making sure that there isn't just the perception that industry is necessarily as a block opposed to taking these kinds of steps. Mick, what's coming to you now in terms of next steps? What do you think? What more can the Parliament do to keep the pressure up? What do you want to see from the Commission, other actors, to make sure that we actually this time get towards the establishment of these targets?
Thanks very much. God, I didn't think I was radical at all, Sirpa. I don't know where you got that idea from. Look, obviously, it's very challenging, right? And as Sirpa said, change is always difficult. It's like as if the human being is kind of basically conservative. So breaking them out of that mode is challenging all times. I suppose it also needs to be our approach. It has to be a global strategy, and the EU can't pursue it all alone either. You know, we could start by amending the UN Sustainable Development Goals to remove the calls for continued global economic growth and to insert calls for debt cancellation for the global south instead, as Jason mentions in his books. We somehow seem to think it's possible to live beyond planet boundaries and to have the self-righteousness to allow ourselves to continue doing this up to 2050 and maybe beyond. But I mean, we need to look at global level and acknowledge that we're eating into the planetary space of other countries. We're keeping them in poverty on purpose so we can have the things we think that we need. And look at how Europe has underdeveloped Africa with its financial imperialism and is still doing it today in places like the Sahel. I mean, we speak about it a lot in the Security and Defence Committee, but we're literally robbing the Sahel blind. And they have 70% poverty, 70% literacy rate, and they have terrible environmental challenges. I mean, Jason deals very well with this in The Divide, and he points out that the financial imbalance between the developed world and the global south is so badly tilted in favor of the rich that it's shocking. Look at, I mean, things have to change. And just speaking about politicians, and look at, I'm probably, even though I'm an optimist, I'm a little. It's hard to be optimistic about how politicians behave. And look at, and I don't want the politicians that were actually on this report were brilliant, and it's why the report ended up so well. And I should point out that, given that, I mean, I think CERPA, coming from the largest party, which I would regard as a right-wing party, CERPA's positions were excellent, and probably not the norm from my point of view for EPP. So, and that was a great boost to the group and to the report. Now, but then just looking at realities, when the chips are down, big business kind of calls the shots still so much. I mean, look, I was involved in I was a shadow for our group on the environment for CAP, the CAP talks. I mean, I'll tell you what, I mean, this went on for about 18 months, right? But I mean, my God, it was so depressing at the end. We literally got a CAP where, I mean, all the talk about the Green Deal, all the talk about farm to fork, all the talk about biodiversity strategy, and then we come up with a CAP that's the same as the last one, where 80% of the money goes to the 20% richest farmers who don't need it. And we didn't go to the space where, I mean, we couldn't even get 10% space allocated for biodiversity on farms. I mean, how bad, like? I mean, it was just shocking, like, I mean, and the manner in which the mainstream media supported the CAP, like, for example, in Ireland, right? I mean, the likes of RTE and most of the print media, they had no problem with the fact that the CAP was a disaster for the environment. We need to help small farmers to move away from pesticides and chemicals, and the CAP money is what that it should be doing that, but it's not. It didn't go to that space. So when it came to the money, the decision of the politicians was poor on CAP. So is it going to be better on this stuff? I mean, remains to be seen. I find too much of the politicians in the hand of the lobbyists and too vulnerable to the lobbyists. Like, for example, I would say that the strongest lobby in Brussels at the moment is probably the arms industry. The arms industry is going off the Richter scale. We're the militarization of Europe, which is completely anti-environmental. The militarization of Europe is progressing at a mad pace. Member states themselves alone last year spent over 200 billion on arms. And for what, like? I mean, who the hell is going to attack us? This idea that Russia or China are going to attack us, I just find it nonsense. But I mean, this is all just for the sake of the arms industry. Well, I mean, if we're going to deal with these environmental challenges, and if the lovely stuff that we've done in this report, if it's going to mean anything else, and if the Commission and the Council go to the space and actually deal with the fact that GDP growth is not sustainable anymore, I mean, this is going to happen. I mean, okay, and how does it happen? And how does it change? Well, I always say that politicians don't change the world. People do. And the people have to change the politicians. And the people of Europe want things to be done different. The people of Europe agree with everything we're saying about moving forward and dealing with the terrible challenges that we're facing. The politicians are not there, but the people are. So how do we change that? And how do we get, we need to inform the people more about everything that's happening so they can put more pressure on their politicians to behave well. We need to get the people to challenge big industry, big agri, challenge them so that it's not as easy for them to behave like they're behaving, so that we get to where we want to get to. Look at it. I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist, but I just find that the challenges are great, and I just think that we're really dependent on the citizens of Europe to come up to the mark. Thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. And so let's hear more in the next session from civil society about that, how they can build that platform. But I think, you know, you've also introduced this additional argument element that will be important, you know, for engaging a lot of people, which is the global justice aspect as well. So that's another lens on this that should be present in the debate, should be an important factor in mobilizing support. But I think, again, that's that same message from Sirpa of the importance of taking on vested interests in industry, finding the business voices that can be more supportive of this, breaking that hold that certain industries have over decision making in Brussels, being critical to moving forward. Margaret, finally, then coming to you, what do you think should happen next? How else can the Parliament keep the pressure on the Commission? Who else needs to do what?
Yeah, first and all, just brief, because I intend to make it brief, but just remind you, grassroots are wonderful, but you need also grass and bushes and trees, because if not, you just stay under beneath the earth. And we need to have and act as leaders, all of us, and not only, and that is, I think, has to be stressed again and again to the people gathered here, politicians, scientists, and so on, so people can feel that somebody take their case, because if not, nothing will happen. And let me then say that we should, of course, now make a clear mandatory goals and demands, and we should also do it for the sake of the progressive industry, because if we don't have binding targets, then they are too vulnerable to undermining, populist lobbyists. We have seen it. Mick mentioned what has happened from the agro-industrial complex up to the CAP, and Sirpan mentioned a great deal too. So we need to have and be courageous enough to make these mandatory goals, also for the sake of the progressive industry. And let me then mention, I think we had a good list of important initiatives also mentioned from Jason Hickel here now. What should be now the product demands, so that we make sure that we have a much more safe production, and we are sure that we can also have a circular waste handle. But reduction again is the important part. I still think that we need also having economists who can show us how the society can be built up without all these injustices, because it's really needed that we don't lose also in our own society a big number of people who are unemployed and feel set aside. That has to be done. But let me say that the products demands in our circular economy report should be really made clear and mandatory to future products, so that we at least can do it this way. And then, of course, we should continue, as we do here, our campaign, and shouldn't let lobbyists scare us. But remember how easy they can get to people, telling them that they will be unemployed if these crazy politicians come through. And that's what happened within farming, that's what happened within the car industry, that's what happened all these places mentioned. It's not used as an argument within the weapon industry, but they have a heavy grip on our our governments and so on. But this has to be done, and it has to be done at the national parliaments. We have to work with national parliaments. We have to work also networking with our own party colleagues in other parliaments to make sure that they put pressure on their governments, so they will behave in a more clever way in the council. It's normally the council which is very reactionary when we should have legislation through, and they are much more vulnerable normally to lobbyists than we are in the parliament. So there we need so much the national parliaments to be much more, to step up and put these conditions on their governments, so we don't have the whole time the feeling that when you're negotiating with the government, you're negotiating with the farm lobby or whom else, but you're really with responsible politicians, also from the national, also in the member states. But let me say here, thanks for this here, and we must continue and not give up, but we should be very realistic what is possible, bearing in mind what came from the Environmental Agency about green growth, bearing in mind, now I'm just having a little side step to climate. I just think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, you had the report or the big article in Conversation on Earth Day from James Robert Watson, and three guys there telling that this we had been catch in a trap on this minus emission, which is now in the climate law. And we need to have all these things at the table as soon as possible, not to be trapped again and again and again in fairy tales, that we can continue our way, and how wonderful it will be, because it will be really a battle. But we can get industry on our side if they feel that they can trust us, and if they start their investment and research and development, then they are safe and not exposed to suddenly being undermined by lobbyists, let me put it like that. But I must finish here. I think we have already exceeded the time now for close to 10 minutes from this panel here. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Margaret. That's right. So we're keen to move on now, but thank you to all three of you. And I think, some clear takeaways there, the importance of having scientific and technical clarity on what is needed, on this establishment of the budgets, on how we can measure and track our progress, the importance of building broad-based civil society support and demand to create that political space, the importance of jobs in particular being central here, and making sure that we think carefully about the employment implications of reducing material throughput in the economy and how to compensate that, and relatedly mobilizing those supportive private sector voices that are on board with this transition, that recognize, that understand the science and want to move in this direction. So there's some really clear takeaways there, and I'm going to now invite the second panel to come off mute, turn on your videos. Thanks again to Mick, to Margaret, and to Sirpa. On this panel, we've got representatives from the European Commission, from Eurostat, and from civil society. And I'm going to turn straight away to Emmanuel Mayer from DG Environment. You've heard, this clear demand from the Parliament and from the scientific community to move forward. I know that it's a topic that you are working on in the Commission, that you're concerned about, that you're looking at options. Can you give us an update? Where is the Commission at on this topic? What are you thinking? What could we expect from the Commission in response to the Parliament's report?
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, Tim, for organizing that discussion, which also allows a better discussion sometimes. And so really grateful for that, and also grateful to the European Parliament for the massive support that it gave to the Circular Economy Action Plan that was proposed a year ago. So it was not an easy piece of work. Many political groups had a lot of views on the actions that we proposed. And so it's very, very important for us to have the views of the European Parliament, the support of the European Parliament together with the Council, to be able to move ahead under the mandate of Ursula von der Leyen. Maybe also to recall that the Circular Economy Action Plan is really an action-oriented agenda, which is focused very much on products, and this was supported by both the European Parliament and the Council. So we should not focus on waste only, but really put the emphasis on products. And this came very clearly also in the debate this morning, that we need to do better in terms of sustainable products which are placed on the market of the European Union. Also on how to empower consumers, that we have sketched out two possible proposals to reinforce consumer information and to fight misleading green claims. And also on the value chains, on batteries and vehicles, on packaging, on plastic, on textiles, on electronics, on food, water, and nutrients. So there are a lot of opportunities to already comment on the 35 actions that we have proposed. For example, on sustainable product policy, the time of the consultation of citizens is now. So there are many possibilities to get involved. There are also many possibilities to get involved in the context of the recovery. The Circular Economy Action Plan was presented early enough to influence also the direction of the recovery plans, and also the budgets for innovation, but also for regional policy. Now the governance of all the funding is almost finished, and so there will be also huge opportunities for citizens, regions, cities, businesses to get support to succeed in this transition towards a climate neutral and circular economy. So that's clear. On the question of the goals, you know, the Circular Economy Action Plan offers a vision of the EU roads towards a circular economy. I mean, the first page of the Circular Economy Action Plan calls for keeping the resource consumption within planetary boundaries, to strive to reduce its consumption footprint, and to double its circular material use rates in the coming decade, so by 2030. Because we see an opportunity in the fact that for now, we're using only 12% of recycled materials in the economy, and we are relying 88% on virgin, on raw materials. So there is a great opportunity to do much better on that. And so the way we monitor the transition to a circular economy is by having a so-called monitoring framework, which dates back 2018. And it's true that the 10 indicators that were designed at the time were very much focusing on waste indicators. Mostly, I would say, because we had several pieces of waste legislation that had identified solid indicators so that we would be able to report on this. But now, very clearly, we see, and that was already a call, I think, in 2018 by the Environment Committee and also by the Council, to try to do better on the sustainable consumption and production side. So this is why we would like to have new indicators set up in the context of the new circular economy monitoring framework, which we would like to draft by the end of this year. And the idea would be to focus on the interlinkages between circularity, climate neutrality, and zero pollution ambition, but also to have new indicators on resource use, including consumption and material footprints, to account for the consumption patterns of the European Union. And before deciding on the setting of new binding targets, we think that work needs to happen on these indicators. We need, and I think it was also recalled in the discussion, we need solid indicators, science-based indicators. We need to make sure that this is feasible across the 27 member states as well. And if this is not, how to find ways to support them. I mean, we don't want greenwashing in indicators. We want to have solid indicators there. And so I think this is a very important part of the equation is, you know, how do we team up together to have a very solid basis and not, you know, try something out of the blue and realize a few years down the road that we need to change it all, giving no long-term security also, as MEP Petikainen was referring to. I would just maybe add two other elements on the type of references we could use. We are very much tempted by using the consumption footprint, which is an existing indicator which has been developed by the Joint Research Center, and that builds on official data and on modeling and using life cycle assessment methodologies, so that we don't focus only on one aspect, let's say CO2, which is very important, but we completely forget the ecotoxicity or the land use element. So we think it's super important to consider this consumption footprint. But there we see that more work is needed on the data collection and on the methodology before this would be fully ready. And then on the material footprint, this is an indicator which is already used by some member states. It is gathered on a voluntary basis at member states level based on the model developed by Eurostat, and my colleague from Eurostat, Arturo, will speak on this. But then we have still a number of loopholes with the collection of data with member states. And then the issue there is, how do we consider the sustainability of sourcing and the link with the environmental impact through this indicator? So, I mean, this is the type of questions that we are facing at this point in time within the European Commission. It was also recalled by the MEPs that spoke beforehand that we are not alone in this. We are working with member states, with the European Environmental Agency, but there is more work to be done to make sure that we have a solid indicator as a condition to move ahead in a solid manner, I would say. Thank you.
Well, fantastic, Emmanuel. Thanks for that overview and some encouraging news there, I would say, particularly about the developments in the circular economy monitoring framework. I want to come back to you later about the target setting in particular, but since you've spoken about some of the technical challenges around these indicators, the importance of having a solid set of indicators to base these targets on, it's ideal now to turn to Arturo de la Fuente from Eurostat, who's one of the, I think, foremost experts on exactly these technical questions. So, Arturo, thanks so much for joining us. And can you give us a bit of a sense? I mean, Emmanuel there referred to the work of the JRC on the consumption footprint, which is, well, that's a challenging report to get through. But I know that in Eurostat, you guys have been working a lot to improve the methodology around the material footprint as well. And so can you give us an update on the state of play in Eurostat with gathering this data, with refining these methods, and with mainstreaming this across member states? What can we expect in terms of the improvements in this regard over the coming months?
Great, thank you very much, Tim. I'm very happy to be here and to answer your questions about this. Yes, I would like to talk about the material footprints that Eurostat produces. We use a different methodology than the JRC. We use input-output modeling, but we have been publishing material footprints since 2013. So we have 8 years of experience publishing data for the EU as a whole. We call our material footprint raw material consumption, is the name of the indicator that we use, and it participants in the event today can go to Google and find it. So we have been publishing this data for 8 years now. We have been refining the way we do it, and it's everything completely transparent, and everything is available in our website, and the results can be replicated. We do not only produce estimates for the EU every year, but in addition, we promote that the member states authorities also produce material footprints. And we provide them with a compilation kit that they can use and they can adapt, or they can do it with a different approach and methodology. We also facilitate guidelines, and we even provide financial support to the national authorities in the member states to produce these estimates. And we also have a voluntary data collection that we collect every year. And we have data from 9 member states that plus Switzerland that want to report this data, but we don't have data for all the member states. So we do have for the EU, and we have for 9 member states, but not for everyone. This is basically the current situation. We also produce statistics that are related to material footprints, but are not footprints, about things that were mentioned before: resource productivity and decoupling, about indicators for the circular economy, circular material use rate, this type of things. We are also producing this type of information. And we use international standards to do that, global standards agreed with the United Nations, OECD, FAO, World Bank, and others. Now, what do we want to do this year? Several things. I think this is going to be a good year for material footprints from Eurostat side. We are going to add an extra chapter in the Eurostat SDG report on monitoring progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. There is going to be an extra chapter about spillover effects that is going to use material footprints. We also want to include, as Emmanuel said, material footprints in the monitoring framework for the circular economy. Here, I remind the audience that the Eurostat is also a service of the European Commission, and we are also involved in the discussions about the update of the monitoring framework, and we have an interest in including material footprints in this monitoring framework this time. And we want to start publishing first estimates for all the member states, for material footprints for all the member states who do not report the data to us yet. As I said, we have a data collection. Some member states report, but others don't. So for those who do not report data to us, we want to start producing first estimate this year as a way to incentivize them to take over from us, from Eurostat in the next years, that they can start producing their own estimates, and at that time, they would replace what the Eurostat would publish as a first estimate. So if we get these 3 things, this extra chapter in the SDG report, the material footprints in the monitoring framework for the circular economy, and we start publishing data for all the member states, in addition to everything we have been doing for almost a decade for the EU, I think we are going to get a big improvement.
Fantastic. And well, I love that line that it's going to be a good year for material footprints. So that gives us a lot of hope that we are indeed firming up the technical data gathering and measurement side of this challenge. Let's turn now then to Maeve. Maeve, you've been at Friends of the Earth Europe, but working with many other colleagues I know across civil society in pushing on these topics. I know that you engaged a lot in supporting MEPs around their report on the circular economy action plan. You've been pushing for the establishment of targets for material footprint or consumption footprint at the EU level for some time. So let's just ask you, what do you take away from what you've heard so far? Are you encouraged by what you've heard, and what do you think should really happen now?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, firstly, thanks for having me speak and for organizing this and keeping the momentum going on this important topic. I've found the discussions generally very inspiring so far, which is great, but also I think then when you hear the speakers from the Commission and Eurostat, it brings back how complex it actually is in exactly how to go about setting a target and how to reach it and engaging with member states. But I think these kind of discussions need to happen more and more for it to happen. In terms of how Friends of the Earth Europe, we actually started working specifically on consumption and resource use indicators back in 2009. I was actually having a look at the study that we commissioned back then to start this work, link it in the chat afterwards. But in it, we developed the concept of the 4 footprints as a measurement of overall resource use, so material, land, water, and carbon footprints. And we've carried these through in our work on resources and circular economy in various ways since then. And it's in the past year or so, we kind of zoomed in and started focusing particularly on the material footprint indicator. It's one of the most well developed from the 4 footprints. as we've heard, it's already in the SDGs as an indicator. The Dutch government actually set a target on a similar indicator, material footprint, but without biomass, which has its own problems. But yeah, our aim was really to try to get it as a headline indicator with the target in the Commission's new Circular Economy Action Plan last March. So we worked closely with the European Environmental Bureau, NGO, and researchers in Vienna University. Our argument was really like, we have emissions reductions targets for climate. We need the same in terms of material reduction in circular economy policies. They need to be designed with this as the goal in a binding way, rather than, I know there's language in there about staying within planetary boundaries, but there's nothing that holds to account on, say, for example, setting a target on where we need to go and then designing policies towards that. What we've seen so far with previous circular economy action plans and other work on resource efficiency is consumption is either stabilizing or increasing, and it needs to go drastically down. So this is why we've been pushing for a target. Mick and some others actually mentioned kind of these policies that are aimed with maybe just false or distracting aims that we're seeing a bit. So decoupling, that's been talked about, which is shown more and more to be an impossible aim, that economic growth is intrinsically linked with resource consumption and is likely to continue to be so, and that we really need to focus on reducing absolute consumption regardless of whether the economy grows or not. Another I've seen mentioned in the chat is resource efficiency, which of course is important, but often if the sole focus is on efficiency, we've seen it leads to what's called the rebound effect, and in the end more absolute consumption. Another which is important to focus on in parallel definitely is and Emmanuel mentioned it, the consumption footprint, so looking at the impacts from our consumption. But often we get caught in the trap of, okay, we can consume as usual but make it greener. So reduce the impacts but keep consuming the same, so it often ends up leading to problem shifting, where switching, making a product from a different material that may be less impactful, but yeah, you're still consuming the same in general and creating other impacts. Of course, this is important, and we really support the JRC's work on consumption footprint. It's excellent if you can have a read of their report. Finally, there's a lot of, all over the world at the moment, the big thing is decarbonisation, and that's really even what industry, they're focused on decarbonisation. But we're really, dematerialisation needs to happen in parallel. It was interesting, we sent a letter on the Raw Materials Action Plan last year to the Commission, and one of the responses we got from Commissioner Breton was that focus for the Commission is on decarbonisation and climate neutrality, and reducing materials is a long-term goal. It can happen after we've done after we've decarbonised, after we've become climate, but that's, the two must happen together. You can't decarbonise unless you focus also on reducing materials, as Jason pointed out in his presentation. And kind of a really visible example of this is the massive push for replacing fossil fuel cars with electric cars, which is huge at the moment. And there's no questioning from a lot of people over, okay, should we continue consuming just the same amount of private cars? Yes, in the long run, if we have electric cars, maybe there's a lower or zero carbon footprint, but there's going to be a much bigger material footprint, conflicts from mining, land footprint. So it's really, you need to look at the overall system and reduce private cars. So there are some kind of maybe distractions or false aims that I wanted to point out. And yeah, in the end, as we know, we got the material footprint in the monitoring framework of the circular economy, which is great, so that there's more momentum to work on the complexities of it, and that the Parliament put it in their report, which we, with the EB, worked very hard to get MEPs on board with this as well. And that was a good success. In terms of engaging, maybe I'll touch in the next round on the whole building public support, but just quickly on the targets. So we had originally been pushing for a 50% material footprint reduction target back more than a year ago, by 2030. It was a little bit of a random choice, I have to say, but since then we've been engaging more with research and experts to figure out, okay, what is a sustainable and just limit? And there is, there's a good bit of research, maybe not as much as there needs to be, and this is something that the Commission can do, but we do know from the research that's out there, EU material footprint is around 14 tonnes per person at the moment. The global average is about 12. Stefan Bringsu, who's done a huge amount of research on this, quotes 5 tonnes per person as material footprint within limits. The UN in their Human Development Index quote 10 tonnes. The German Environment Agency have actually done research on various scenarios and say it's possible to achieve a reduction to 4.1 tonnes per person by 2050. So whatever way you look at it, we're consuming well over limits and we need to reduce. There's also the distribution aspect and who's consuming most. I won't go into so much detail on that, as Jason did a very good job and others. I'll stop there and say more in the next round.
Yeah, thanks, Maeve. Thanks. So that's really helpful to focus a little bit on those numbers that eluded the Parliament position, but start to give some sense of the orders of magnitude involved. Emmanuel, if we can come back to you then. So as we've heard from Arturo, there is progress then, particularly on the material footprint. This is, let's say, maturing as an indicator, and I think certainly by the end of this year, based on Arturo's inputs, we should therefore have a solid indicator, which is for which data is being collected across the member states, reflected hopefully in the monitoring framework, as well as in some other reports, such as the SDG monitoring report. So at that point, do you feel like it will then be possible to move towards target setting using material footprint as a reasonable proxy for the types of environmental damage that we know are associated with consumption? Is that the moment, once we have those building blocks in place, that the Commission would be able to move forward? And which of the legislative initiatives could be relevant here? There's been a lot of talk in the chat, I know, about the Sustainable Products Initiative, which you have referred to. Could that be a possible hook for introducing some language around establishing targets for aggregate material footprint reductions?
Thanks a lot. I think that for now, we need to engage beyond the European Commission on the future monitoring framework. Mm-hmm. And so this we will do with a number of experts from the member states in different groups, because they have the knowledge, and we need to make sure that the system is solid, and also contact colleagues at the European Parliament and get the views from stakeholders. And we need to have that discussion on, the type of indicators. We have heard from Arturo that they are setting up a lot of actions to improve the data collection, for example, on the material footprint indicator. But again, I think that we will also need to have the discussion in relation to the consumption footprint. I mean, the main difference is that if we consider the material footprint only, you can have, a country with a low material footprint, which would still have a very high impact on, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why, I'm also calling for discussions on the type of indicators, and this needs to take place with member states and needs to remain feasible, which is extremely important, because in the past discussions on the monitoring framework, we had a lot of discussions with member states on the administrative burden that we're placing on several, on 27 administrations. So it's not also a light aspect when we have these discussions. So the idea is to be able to update the monitoring framework at the end of the year, and again, before deciding on any type of targets, this is the priority we have. I saw so many questions in the context of the Sustainable Product Policy Initiative. Just to flag that the initiative, the legislative proposal is set for the end of the year by the European Commission, and then the work would start with the European Parliament and the Council. This is crucial times in terms of consultations, but we're organizing also a number of workshops on several specific aspects, like the digital product passports, which is also a great way to look at what is in product and the environmental footprint of products as well. So please do not hesitate to follow the different steps. We generally publish all the information on the circular economy stakeholder platform, which is also a great way to be all mobilized for a circular economy. But we don't plan to integrate targets in the Sustainable Product Policy Initiative, which basically aim to revise the old eco-design directive to go beyond energy-related products and energy efficiency in what we mean by sustainable products. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I guess, so that's well understood, the importance to move slowly to get the indicators solid first. I think the relationship between the material footprint and the consumption footprint, and for those which are not deeply involved in the differences here, as Emmanuel says, the consumption footprint is an attempt not just to measure the total amount of materials being consumed in the economy, but the environmental damages or implications of the use of those materials. I think it's fair to say, Arturo, that it's a much more complex indicator to develop. And given what you've said, that we are now at the cusp of moving forward on the material footprint, getting member states to finally use that consistently. To what extent do you think that the material footprint is a reasonable, pragmatic proxy in the meantime for those environmental damages, even while we continue to develop that more sophisticated consumption footprint metric? Is that your view, that this is a reasonable proxy? It can still tell us important things about the environmental implications of our consumption, and that there's a basis to move ahead with that, even while we continue to refine the methods for the consumption footprint?
Yes, the answer is yes. I think it's a reasonable proxy. The approach that we use in Eurostat for footprints is that we have separate footprints we have footprints for materials that is what we are discussing about, but we also publish in footprints for greenhouse gases, and we have other footprints for air pollutants and other footprints for energy use, and we are working on other footprints for land. So we have separate types of footprints instead of bundling everything together into one single footprint, ecological or environmental footprint. But what we do is we build these footprints sort of using a standard methodology and standard data sources in such a way that they are sort of building blocks, like a Lego, that you can build up to do interpretation. So it's a different approach. We don't try to bundle everything together, but we do it in a way in which it can be done at later stages of analysis. But the analysis of the footprints and the storytelling from them is a challenge, because the footprint itself is a complex vision, a complex phenomenon, a complex concept. And it indeed is something where we also have to improve, is telling a narrative and a storytelling and an analysis about how the footprints are. I would like to say that the biggest sort of challenge from the measurement viewpoint to achieve the level of solidity that Emmanuel is missing or would like to have is due to the fact of the the global scale of the footprints. It really brings me back to what Jason explained at the beginning, that the consumption that we have in the EU is inducing changes in the rest of the world. This is true, but it's also true when you want to measure it. What we want to measure is how the consumption in the EU induces changes in the rest of the world. And for that, we need more statistics about the rest of the world and more statistics about how things are produced, how the beef is grown in the USA, or how the cars are made in China, etc. And in the Commission, we don't have, and in Eurostat, we don't have a mandate to collect this data. We collect data for the EU, for the member states of the EU, and we have better data for some countries in our near to us, in our neighborhood, but we don't collect data for China, in particular about, and I'm not talking about imports and exports, I'm talking about production structures, how the things are constructed and built in China that then are exported to Europe. We don't have enough data in our office to do this alone. So the way really to move forward to improving the quality is reaching this data from these countries from outside of the EU, together with international agencies, other organizations. And we work together with OECD on footprint, material footprints, and we work together with UN and other international agencies about environmental accounts to have international standards so that we can get better data for other countries and standardized with the same definitions and concepts that we used in Europe. And we are making progress there, but as any effort in which you need to, many stakeholders to put their bits, and where you need to engage new countries to start producing these statistics this way, these things take time. We started a long time ago. We have been working on this way for decades, and we have reached a lot of progress, but something that will remain forever is the fact that Eurostat will always have more statistics and more information about what is happening in Europe than about what is happening in China. This will always be like that. So there is going to be always an element of uncertainty about how sure are we that this material footprint is correct. And this is something we must accept, that there is always going to be an element of uncertainty. Now, this is different on whether we are confident with the number that we have, that the margins of errors are acceptable, that the big picture is correct, etc. But I think it's important to realize of that material footprints in general, environmental footprints in general, have a level of uncertainty.
And economic decisions based on estimates, including with regard to GDP, of course, the whole time. So some margin of error is, as you said, acceptable. And the question is, given the very stark time constraints that we're now under with regard to planetary boundaries, whether we can move ahead with pragmatic proxy indicators, bearing in mind those margins of error to establish policy. And I think that's the point that we're now getting to. We can't let the enemy, let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but need to we're on the cusp of a big move forward in terms of the widespread use and acceptability of material footprints. May have space for Emmanuelle and her colleagues at the Commission, to go ahead once we've got these indicators in hand, to go ahead and set the targets that everyone is saying eventually will be needed.
Yeah, I think in terms of public engagement, I wouldn't say it's about trying to get broader public into the kind of complexities of the target itself, because we know it is quite complex. But like I was saying earlier, comparing it to the climate target, yeah, people all over the world know about climate change, and yes, we need to reduce emissions and set climate targets. That's so maybe trying to get on the same level as that. But in terms of getting people more engaged, and what we've heard, because getting data is so slow, forming targets is slow, and we know we need faster action. I think we actually know a lot of what needs to happen on the ground in terms of, yeah, like people have power at local and national level to push for economic system change and policies and cultural shifts on the ground. And I think a lot of it was mentioned earlier, but yeah, this is what we know will lead towards fundamentally overhauling production and consumption systems. And in parallel, you know, at the this work on targets can happen. But there's more and more people becoming more aware and active on these interconnected topics and linking big things like climate change and our capitalist economic system to what changes need to happen on the ground. Like was mentioned before about transport, so pushing for greater bike infrastructure, accessible public transport, reducing private cars and air travel, or an infrastructure resisting new mines, resisting new developments that are consumer driven, like shopping centres, in products ensuring there is a right to repair, there's a stopping planned obsolescence, strictly regulating the advertisement industry. So there's so many things that we know are kind of degrowth in action and stuff that people can happen in the ground, and then this swell will also push decision makers to actually move quicker on putting bigger shifting policies in place. I know you briefly mentioned, Arturo, the international agenda. There was a commission document last year on leading the way to a global circular economy, and in it there was work mentioned on defining a safe operating space and starting discussions for an international agreement on managing natural resources. It was really welcome, and I know that it fell off the table because, yeah, apparently some other countries wouldn't sign up to that, which is unfortunate, but hopefully it will come back on the table. I think, yeah, these discussions need to happen at the global level as well, like on climate. And it is tough discussions because it's the richer nations that need to really take the strongest action. And it's not like we're telling every country in the world needs to reduce material consumption. No, it's the big, rich and emerging economies that need to lead the way. So I think this discussion on resource budgets globally really needs to happen, because we can do as much. Europe needs to do more than its fair share globally, but also it needs to be an international discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Emmanuel. Well, we're coming right to the end of the time, and it's been a long and I think rich discussion on the need to have greater clarity on the extent of EU consumption, on the potential damage that is doing to the environment, and on the need to move towards both better measuring that and setting the policies and eventually the targets to reduce it. We've seen a clear call, I think, thank you, Emmanuel, from the Commission to engage in the public consultation on key aspects of the Circular Economy Action Plan, including the Sustainable Products Initiative, but also for different stakeholders, including in the Parliament, the scientific, technical community, civil society, to engage in the debate about the Circular Economy Monitoring Framework. That seems to be the next most immediate opportunity to make progress on at least measuring the material footprint. And meanwhile, we need to all do better at building the political narrative around the kinds of economic shifts that are required to move back within our planetary boundaries, focusing in particular on aspects like jobs, on our vision of the good life, on finding the co-benefits for citizens of making this transition. But also, I think, picking up on Maeve's final point there, the importance of the EU continuing to show leadership globally on this issue, as it has sought to do on the climate issue, being the first to put regional targets on the table to reduce material consumption would be a game changer, I think, internationally, in showing the EU again at the forefront of moving towards a more circular economy and achieving its multiple environmental objectives. So I think we're on the path. It feels like there is momentum building off the Parliament's vote this time, and I hope that by continuing to engage, we can ensure that this time we really do make a concrete progress. So thank you so much for everyone that has joined. Thank you to all of the speakers for the discussion. We really look forward to continuing to engage you all. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to take the inputs from all of you today and include those in our paper on this topic, and we'll look forward to circulating and discussing that with you in due course. So thank you so much for today, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.